history nerds and historians. My name is Christina.
And I'm Lindsay.
And this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little bit of history that's super fucked up.
Super fucked
That's
up.
super fucked up. Okay.
It's my favorite intro to anything ever.
Really? I came up with it on the fly and I enjoy it. It's just fun to say. Okay.
But it's snazzy.
It is. It's super fun. So Deerfield, Massachusetts is a small town in Franklin County, Massachusetts, which is in like western Massachusetts along the Connecticut River. It's just over 30 square miles. And in 2022, it had a population of about 5,000 people. If you were to drive through Deerfield today with no knowledge of its history, you'd probably mostly take notice of the Deerfield Academy, which is like a pretty like bougie exclusive boarding school, or
Exactly,
you'd be
bougie.
realizing that like that's where the Yankee Candle headquarters is. But
Claim to fame.
What was that?
Claim to fame.
Claim to fame is that is where the Yankee Candle headquarters is. So if you go to like the historic area though, and you really take the time to like read the plaques on many of the historic houses, or you go to like the little historic cemetery, or go to the historic societies and museums, you'll see a lot of talk of the year 1704. So this is why I have brought my very good friend Lindsay with me here today, because Lindsay kind of like grew up in the area. She really loves the area, and she knows a lot about the history. She's probably like in the top like 3% of people who have like all of the knowledge in their brain.
Why are you so kind and so nice? 3%, it's not only specific, but it's very, very humbling.
You are so knowledgeable though, and you are so like, I know that you sometimes feel like there are people who know more about things, but like you have done so much research and so much like deep diving into it that I think you know way more than you ever could. So
You're so sweet. But it's easy to do research into something that you love.
yeah,
And that's how I ended up going back to grad school and finishing my degree. Was I started researching things and reading books on my own, and I was like, I could do something
yeah.
with this,
I
and
mean,
I can talk about it.
That's the same way that I went into my master's
Yeah.
program. So for any of my listeners, we met in the master's program. That's how we became the best friends.
Shout out to Salem State University. Say what?
Woohoo, go Vikings. We're the Vikings, right? That's what we are.
Go Vikings.
So that's, I mean, that's what I did with history of witchcraft too. I was just like reading some books and doing some research and being like, how do I not know this stuff? And what more can I learn in doing things? So
Exactly.
you kind of do the same thing that I did, where, you know, in our master's, we had to do a historiography class, which for any listeners who don't know anything about like the study,
it's boring and I would never want to do it again.
It's boring. You never want to do it again. Historiography is basically like the study of the history of a topic. So you basically like go through and you will look at what all different like historians and people have said about a topic. So you did what I did, where you wrote your big long paper that we had to write for our degree, and also your historiography on the same thing, which is honestly a smart way to do it. I don't know why people didn't.
I don't either. And I can understand people who love stuff and want to learn a bunch of things. Like I love colonial America and also the Holocaust, but I was taking so many classes on the Holocaust and I wanted to pump up my knowledge. So I just read books, and then I used some books for one thing and some books for another. And all of the knowledge now lives in my brain.
Forever. You'll never get
forever and ever. And then I just podcast it out.
You'll be like 96 years old in a retirement home, just being like, Reverend Williams, let me tell you all about it.
If you haven't seen this door, you're missing out on something special.
So
foreshadowing to whatever the door is that we talk about, which I will talk about in extent.
With the door in extent for sure. So so today we're going to talk about the raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts, that happened in 1704. It's sometimes referred to also as the Deerfield Massacre, but we're kind of trying to move away from that kind of verbiage, because it is really like, when you say massacre, it definitely puts like an
connotation on it.
Yeah, it definitely puts like, it's like, you know, when you say like, how fast was the car going when it hit that car, or how fast was the car going when it slammed into the car, like you're going to have a completely different kind of connotation about it.
And some people want you to have that connotation about it, and some people use that word specifically to jar you into something like that, which, you know, there's both sides of the story. This the raid on Deerfield was intense.
Yeah, it was, which we're going to talk about. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your oh, good God, what the fuck faces. So, before we talk about you get to see it in real time. Lindsay listens to the podcast, but she doesn't like watch me do it in real time, which is kind of a little weird right now.
But
So
it's a very special treat for all of our listeners to
I'm
watch
sure
her podcast.
I'm sure it is. So before we get into the raid that happened in 1704, can we talk a little bit about like the politics and everything that led up to raid that happened in February? So like the War of Spanish Succession and like all of that kind of stuff.
Sure,
Yeah.
we absolutely
Cool.
can. Let's start with the fact that the new world, as people are trying to get away from that kind of term because it technically wasn't new to the people that lived there, but it was new to the people that invaded it.
Right.
So the French and the English came over to the continental North America and started to settle there, even though there were already settlers there, and started to create their different colonies, which were offsets of the European, French, Spanish, English, other countries that were there. And what ended up happening was the colonies that were created in North America, specifically, we're going to focus on the French and the British, were extensions of the ones that were in Europe. So in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the wars that happened in Europe fell over into the colonies in North America. And the one that we're specifically focusing on today is in Europe. It was called the War of Spanish Succession, but the name of it, of the name of that the English people gave to in when they were in the colonies, was Queen Anne's War. And Queen Anne's War started in 1702, and it was based upon the the Spanish throne and who was going to succeed in the Spanish, and the English wanted some people and the French wanted some other people. And that fight in Europe fell over into the New World as it is. But what was happening when the colonies were created was the French and the British came over, and they were taking over land that was owned by native people that had lived there for tens of thousands of years.
Right.
One can understand that there was much conflict associated with that. You wouldn't want someone to walk into your house and just decide it was theirs and then kick you out, or I don't know, murder you. Colonialization is a one of those buzzwords that's happening now, based on the current events that are happening in 2024 and whatnot. It's one of those buzzwords. But there were many fights that we could go into for many hours that had happened in the colonies that were in North America. But Massachusetts Bay Colony, that was founded by the Pilgrims, and they had Indian and indigenous people that supported them in trying to make sure that they were stable enough to support living life there, and the different cities that were growing around Boston. They got oversaturated. There was many people that were coming from Europe that wanted to settle in the New World. The 1800s, as they had already established practices that were working. They were building houses. Generations were starting to be born in the New World. So the towns near Boston were getting overpopulated. Right. Not to mention the adage of the Puritans coming over here to escape religious persecution. They wanted to come over here and practice their religion freely, but one of the things that they did is they tried to convert the local indigenous population to their religion. And instead of letting them practice what they wanted to, they actually kind of turned into their own, the victims turned into the persecutors. And they tried to create different areas in which the indigenous people could congregate as well as live as well as convert to the Puritan Protestant religion. So these were referred to as praying towns.
Yeah.
And the Massachusetts Bay Colony had taken a part of an established town of Dedham and on the border of a town that's called Natick and converted into a praying town. And the people of Dedham were upset that some of the land was being taken away and they were being overpopulated by the indigenous population and they wanted some more space. So people of Massachusetts Bay Colony sent over some surveyors towards the western part, going more west into the frontier, as it was. Funny enough, that's actually the name of one of the Deerfield Frontier Regional, because they went out into this vast open wasteland of meadows and fertilized land and said, wow, this looks like a really great place to settle down. So they decided, like, kind of like a cartoon, like stuck their flag in it and says, let's take this one. This one sounds great. Not even unbeknownst to them, but at that exact moment, there was no settlers in the area. There was no people living there. But at one point, and for most of the tens of thousands of years that they were there, the Pecumtuck Indians were there, and the tribe of the Pecumtucks settled on the land in between the Deerfield River, which is what we call it now, but the Deerfield River and the Connecticut River, which created a very large fertile land. The surveyors went over there to try to find this land and said, look at how fertile and how great it is to be farmed and used for agricultural reasons. No one was there. And the reason for that is because there were so many intertribal wars. Mohawk Indians, which are in the upstate Connecticut, lower Canadian area, they had come down to try to trade with some of the Pecumtuck and other tribes in this area, and they ended up having a couple too many fights. So at that point, the Pecumtucks were not there because there had just been a large fight between them and the Mohawks, and the Mohawks actually went back to where they were. So in taking this land, they actually they tried to the English settlers had tried to come around and do the legal thing, and I say that with air quotations, even though you can't see me, and trying to recognize that this land wasn't theirs, and they wanted to buy the land. So they kind of took it, and then they tried to backwards try to legalize it by trying to get the people that were actually in the area to sign over a deed. So these people of Dedham actually said that they got a deed signed by the chief of the Pecumtucks, but there's actually no corresponding evidence that indigenous person was or even knew what he was signing.
And
So
what year was that?
this is in like the 1660s, 1670s. It took a while for Deerfield to actually be incorporated into a town, but signing over the deed of the land was around that time so that they could start physically moving people over and also surveying different spots of land for people to live in.
So there's no like actual deed, like, do you think that there was actually a deed, or do you think that that's just
there is a deed, and it's signed and written in English, Old English, and signed by John Pincham, who was a wealthy proprietor out of Springfield, Massachusetts. But the actual indigenous person that signed it, like, he didn't sign it Tom or Jerry or whatever. I think his name was Chalk, Chaulk, or that's what it looked that he signed. But there was no way to determine if he had any rights to the land at all, or who he was as an actual human being. So
maybe
I just actually
grabbed an indigenous person
like, hey, you look important.
You can't read what we're writing, and you also can't understand what we're actually saying. Can you just sign this piece of paper so that we can move here? But the interesting thing is like there's a lot of corresponding I mean, that's how Salem was settled that way, of going to the indigenous people and finding who was actually in charge, and having her, who was a female chief, Squaw actually sign off on it, and she like signs her name with a bow and arrow, and it becomes like this big cool thing. So yeah, the Salem area was all obviously indigenous when they came here, and they did the same sort of thing with the deed. And so I'm curious, like, I mean, obviously I'm not from up here, so I don't know how much that was common to sort of like deed the land from the indigenous people who lived here. Do you know anything
Well,
about?
they didn't the these are European, and I say this loosely with as many air quotations as I can, civilized laws that we're putting on a group of people that's not how they work. You know, there
And
there was
I've read some stuff about that when I was in schooling and all of that, and you know, it was very um some of the indigenous people didn't understand in the same way that the
yeah,
Europeans understood it, right? So, you
yeah.
know, you have the Europeans who say, like, if you sign this paper, this says that this land belongs to me. Whereas a lot of the indigenous people would interpret that as, so us signing this means that we're allowing you to like share this with us.
Yeah.
It's not that this belongs to you. It's not that, you know, we're going to leave immediately. It's that we're coming to agreement that we're going to both be in this land and not declare war on each other and kind
Oh,
of
exactly.
like
It was more of
coexist.
the understanding that we have since research is that it was more of a it's ours, but you can share it.
Mhm.
Hey, we travel a lot, but we come back here.
Right.
Feel free to use it. We'll work together to use it, not a like kick you off of the land like a monopoly board piece when you know when you're done and sell off all your property. But that's again, that's the whole point of they're trying to legally obtain this land in a way that the two legalized ideals don't match.
Right. Right.
So it turns into a, oh, we did everything legally, but it doesn't necessarily mean that same thing to the indigenous people that were there. Like I had said before, when the surveyors of Dedham came over to the actual area, they didn't see there wasn't any signs of like land or people living there or whatnot. Um, so they ended up starting to take the area and divide it into the different lots of land to be able to move people over to. And then in the 1660s and 1670s, that's when people actually started to go and live there. And when I mean live there, I mean like it took a long time to build houses and, you know, palisades and churches and stuff. But there were like, you know, little camps and small areas, and so that they could slowly create a life there. There was many different issues where the people that were living in the Deerfield area or the Pocumtuck land at that point were invaded and the area was abandoned. And then the Pocumtucks took it over again, and they were building their area, they were building their villages, and they were farming on it, and they had their whatnot. And then they got attacked, and then it went back to other settlers. So it happened a couple different times. And during the French and Indian Wars, there's a couple of them. Queen Anne's War is one of them. But the King Philip's War.
Getting Christina here. Hi. So Lindsay is wonderful and kind and brilliant and wonderful and beautiful and also very smart and intelligent and one of the best people that I know. And when she was doing this podcast for us, she was completely going off the cuff and completely just free recalling all this information. And in this over hour and a half podcast that we have put out together, and I say we in that I was just sitting here and listening to her, she made one tiny little part where she misspoke, where she just accidentally said the wrong name right here. So King Philip is the English name for a man named Metacom. Metacom was the like great sachem, or which is just like another name for chief of the Wampanoag people who lived in the Plymouth area. She just wanted me to come in and correct that and specify that for you all. Now let me pass it back over to her and her brilliance.
There was a battle that they termed Bloody Brook, where the native tribes in the New England area came together to fight the British settlers, British residents, to try to get their land back, and it ended up being Deerfield being abandoned shortly after that because it was just too much for these Dedham residents to handle. We're in this colonial area of or the colonial frontier, which is what we call it. It's the most western and northern part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony at this time. There was a couple in Maine, but during the French and Indian Wars, they were attacked so many times they also got abandoned. And there was a local area town north of Deerfield, which is they called it Northfield, that also got attacked and got abandoned. So Deerfield was like that 90-degree corner of like where the Massachusetts Bay Colony was. So it was as west as you could get. It was the most frontier. People think of frontier like the Wild West in California and Arizona. Like this was that at that time.
Like probably just as dangerous as when you
Oh,
think of, like, the
it's
wild.
extremely dangerous because there's no one to protect it, and these people that are moving out there are civilians. You know, they didn't establish garrisons and militias there yet because these people from Dedham were just trying to find more space. And again, it was cheaper. You know, I was more dangerous. Land was not so much infrastructure. So people who wanted to go make a fresh start ended up moving to Deerfield to get cheaper land and create these things. Then, of course, many were attacked over and over. There have been 4, 5, 6 attacks by the times we got to 1704, when at that point the resident field there was about maybe
no go ahead.
maybe like there's maybe about like 300 residents in Deerfield at the time of 1704.
So
and
leading up to 1704, I remember us kind of talking about that when you were working on your paper about how wasn't there something with like they were asking for help and they were asking for defenses, and Massachusetts was just kind of like continuously failing Deerfields leading up to 1704?
Yes. So being that the threat of the French and the Indians, that they were afraid we're going to come attack them at any point. Again, with the French and Indian War and King William's War and the beginning of Queen Anne's War, they're in constant threat of being attacked at any point, and they were the most western and at that point most northern part. So not too many of the actual Deerfield residents were trained in the military. So they would, Reverend John Williams, like you had mentioned before, was a prominent minister, the minister of the town of Deerfield, and he spoke on behalf of the residents to the governor, Governor Dudley. And he worked with the government of Connecticut at the time too, because at this point, Deerfield is like, it's a 2-hour drive from Boston today. Like, can you imagine how long it would take to get to Boston back in 1704? Like, it took a really long time. But going down to Connecticut is a lot easier. So, and because it's a straight down shot from following the river into places that were already established, like Springfield, Massachusetts, or Hartford. Mm-hmm. And Deerfield residents asked for military help with soldiers and artillery, and they asked help for wood and different supplies to be able to build their fort around their city, around their town. And a couple different times, the letters either didn't get there or they went back unanswered. There was garrison soldiers that actually came from Connecticut that went up and stayed in Deerfield in the winter of 1703, and then nothing happened, so they left again. Mm-hmm. There were soldiers and there were specific military trained members, but not in the way that we're thinking military now. They're thinking like maybe they have guns and maybe they have different shells and artillery that they could use to defend their home, but not like the rest of the town.
Or like militiamen rather than.
Yeah, exactly. We're not thinking like Last of the Mohicans, Fort William and Henry. Like, it wasn't like that. They actually, my dog is dreaming. He's yelling. I'm sorry.
Her dog is a beagle named Jed. He's the sweetest thing in the entire world. So he can make as much noise as he wants in the background. And if anyone has an issue with that, you can just turn off this recording and we'll get you next time.
He just wants to be a part of the fun.
I love him so much. He's okay.
So after the couple abandonment, after a couple of the times the town had been abandoned, I believe it was in 1702, 1703, like it had been decided by the governor and Massachusetts Bay Colony that Deerfield can no longer be abandoned, that they either had to fight for it, or if it was destroyed, they had to fix it themselves. It was too important to Massachusetts Bay Colony to keep Deerfield as a town. So they started to offer them supplies like different start off with them supplies or money or people to help them build a fort around the center of town. And if you go to Deerfield today, there are there's spots and there's a couple different maps that show you based on the town common and based on where some of the replicas of the houses or some of the houses that are built there, if they would have been inside the Palisades or not.
And so one of the reasons of like standing your ground, do you think it's like a political thing of standing up to the French as much as it is standing your ground in the land, of like showing that the English are strong and a force to be reckoned with? You know, do you know what I mean? Of like, um, if you are an Indigenous person who's allying with the French and you're constantly making us abandon our area, that makes us look weak and that makes us look like we shouldn't be here. Like, do you think any of that factors into it, or any opinion on that kind of thought process behind an additional importance of staying in Deerfield, being that it was the most western and most northern sort of frontier at that time?
I bet that was definitely what the governor had a thought process of, or the people that were in Boston. But the
Dudley was
people,
very, very political. And like
yeah.
Dudley was the one with the witch trials where he was the one who was like, oh, yeah, maybe the witch trials weren't the best thing. Maybe we should start paying retributions to people. Like maybe we should kind of, um sort of erase this mark that we've put on history for this and kind of sweep it under the rug as much as possible. He was very, from what I've gathered, very much a governor that was all about like saving face and trying to look like he had everything together. So
Look
I'm
how strong my colony is. They haven't, they're going to stand up and fight.
we
However,
haven't
you
killed
didn't
witches
offer.
here in like
Yeah,
10 years.
yeah,
Obviously. We're great.
obviously.
We're great,
Um,
we're strong, we're wonderful.
but of what I have researched and understood, there absolutely was not enough support. And the support wasn't long enough. There wasn't enough manpower, there wasn't enough money. There's a note that Dudley gave them a tax break
Mhm.
instead of having them pay the town tax that every town in Massachusetts Bay Colony had to pay. They didn't have to. So congratulations, you can keep the little money that you have already instead of having to pay me. So you can make sure that you build this fortress and trade for guns and buy ammo and that kind of stuff. But the people of Deerfield were terrified. They understood moving out there, it was the wild, wild west and it was dangerous and whatnot, but they were a target. And they were a target specifically because if you had captured Deerfield, Massachusetts Bay Colony starts to shrink. And the closer you get to some of these more established, where more the artillery is, that's where more the money is, that's where the important people are. And there are these French and indigenous tribes coming, not necessarily, but as like a friend of a friend, an enemy of an enemy is my friend kind of thing. Like they all had the same enemy and they all wanted something from the colonial residents. And in turn, the French wanted to make sure that the English were less of a threat, and when it comes to the different lands and the military and whatnot. But these indigenous tribes, they were after some of the settler communities based on the fact that they wanted their land back, or based on the fact that they're fighting something that's referred to as a mourning war, which is residents of indigenous communities that were due to war or being kidnapped or being murdered or whatnot. They would actually take English residents and they would almost try to either replace them specifically, like a man for a man, or try to replace them in the support of they took hostages to enslave them to work on their fields with them, or again, another subset of that is to take women and to marry them into the tribes so that their tribes can repopulate themselves.
Yeah.
So what the the Massachusetts Bay Colony being like, look, we're rough and tumble and we're strong and we're not going to go anywhere. We're almost like leaving these Deerfield people out here as not as bait, but as like almost, because you get to the point where that's where you're looking at. You're not going to come and go into Boston. They're going to slowly work their way and lessen the frontier lines and create a smaller playing field so that they can concentrate their efforts more. And Deerfield was a great way to do that because it narrowed in their area that they had to fight on against, again, a lot of civilians and agricultural farmers and residents and a few garrison militia, but nothing like you would find in some of the bigger cities.
Right. All right, let's get to the topic of the hour. Let's get to February 29th, 1704, 320 years ago.
It's a leap year. It's a very big day.
It is a
And technically, we've had like what, 8 anniversaries, or it's the 320th anniversary that comes up in a couple weeks.
Let me do the math for that. Yeah, so it's actually the 80th anniversary. Yeah. If you go by leap days.
They even switched a calendar in between that at some point.
Yeah, from the Gregorian to the
Julian.
There you go. I was gonna be like from the Gregorian to the other one.
To the other one.
The one that's not the Gregorian calendar. So on February 29th, 1704, it's, from what I've gathered, a really awful winter. Really heavy winter over there.
Wicked heavy.
A wicked winter for my Massachusetts folks. So what happened?
So what happened was it was pre-dawn, February 29th, 1704, and French and their indigenous allies, which were comprised of the Abenaki, the Huron, the some Mohawk, and some different Pecumtucks and some different tribes that were from the the Maine region. A month before that, started walking down in the dead of winter to head towards Deerfield. They knew they were going to attack Deerfield. Deerfield and most of New England had a sense of security because who attacks when it's snow on the ground and it's snowing and it's cold and it's miserable? Who walks a month with 200, 250 people on foot or on rivers that are hopefully at this point covered by ice? Who would attack somebody like that? Right. So there was a false sense of security. And on the night, actually the early morning of February 29th, they only had one soldier on patrol. And I say patrol as I use that word lightly because the legend has it that he fell asleep. He was looking after one of the gates and he had fallen asleep and had not seen the enemy coming across a very, very large meadow that's known as the North Meadow. And the attackers, again, the French and their indigenous tribes, attackers or raiders, had come across in the dead of night and on snow and in snowshoes, and they good at being stealthy. Their houses were actually outside the palisade walls that they were able to maneuver around and not wake those residents because they didn't want to start attacking outside the fort because they knew what was most important was inside the fort. So they actually walked.
It's the most important that they were trying to get.
Specifically, they had their sights set on Reverend John Williams, as well as different people, not necessarily specific people, but Reverend John Williams, who ended up becoming basically a celebrity because of this, was like one of the most important people in the town. So moving around, at this point, there's anywhere between 250 and 300 men of French and indigenous tribes coming down to attack Deerfield. It's February. It's in the middle of winter. There was a lot of snow. So they were in snowshoes and they were trying to be quiet, maneuvering around the houses that were outside the palisades. The snow was so heavy and it was so fresh that they actually, there was so much snow built up against the walls that some of the raiders actually were able to climb up the snow and go over the side of the walls and turn around and open the gates and let 250 to 300 people come into the center of town.
Honestly, the smart way to do it. If you're gonna
Honestly, it got to the point where that one garrison soldier who, again, legend has it, was asleep, didn't hear any of this. It wasn't bothered because no gunshots and no one was screaming, no one was crying yet. Now, when the gates opened, that's when shit hit the fan.
Yeah.
And what happened is they the battle plan indicated that they went right to Reverend John Williams' house first. They actually passed a couple very large houses that had people in it, but as soon as they got to the Williams house, that was in the I believe it was in the no, it was definitely in the northern part of the fort. But when they got to John Williams' house, they actually split into 3 different groups. The raiders split into 3 different groups, and some went more towards the south to get some of those houses. Some went to the right, some went to the left. But the raiders actually infiltrated Williams' house immediately. There was actually a garrison soldier stationed inside his house, and they blew right past him, and they actually went up and captured John Williams like right away. There's long drawn out stories, and we'll get into this many times because Reverend John Williams actually wrote the most detailed, thorough account that we have of the raid and of his captivity, which is called the Redeemed Captive Return to Zion. It was his diary. So he actually was able to, while he was captured and incarcerated and taken as a prisoner up to Canada, he was actually able to record a lot of things. So that's how we know that they were able to go in and kill 2 of his children, and they got past the garrison soldier. And by the time that the raiders came up to his bedroom, he had drawn a gun and he had pointed it at a raider, an indigenous raider, and pulled the trigger, but it misfired. So because it misfired, the indigenous person didn't kill him. They actually captured him. But the tale of it is that had he had actually pulled the trigger and the bullet had actually killed the indigenous person, that his comrades would have actually come and attacked him and probably murdered him right there. So the fact that his gun didn't go off was actually an idea that maybe it saved his life. And that's how we got this whole diary account.
So I find it fascinating, this whole idea, like he was a reverend and his gun misfired. Did he take that as like divine intervention because of that whole idea that, you know, if
he thinks it saved his life, or scholars think that he thinks he saved his life? Yeah. Being that they were early colonial residents, God influenced everything. What they ate, how they felt, if they cried or not.
The sun shining in the sky, the dog barking in the distance.
Exactly. So the fact that there's again a couple different legends that Deerfield was. This isn't really a legend, but people say that some of the people that were settlers in Deerfield were like not running from the law, but like not the most upstanding people. So being a reverend, and he would do like 4-hour sermons, and he would make sure everyone did their daily readings, and he'd go check on people, make sure they were being pious to God. And some people weren't. And there was this whole story about this woman whose husband got taken captive in one of the previous Indian wars, and she magically got pregnant. So again, like never in history was the raid blamed on a woman having premarital sex. Probably, you know, it's absolutely crazy. And she was actually executed. Like, it's a very sad story.
Okay, never mind. I was making a joke, but now, now I feel like it's in poor taste.
A lot of things about colonial America are in poor taste.
Yeah, that's true. So to go on sort of like, I want to finish talking about this, but it's so interesting to me, this whole idea that like they were safe in the middle of the winter. Because obviously, like, you know what my specialty is: history of witchcraft, Salem witchcraft.
Wait, what? No.
I know, it's total news to you. I know. But the interesting thing is that there are some historians for the Salem witch trials. So literally just 12 years before this. Like, you know, it's a whole different century, but it's only
12 years and inches away. Yeah. All the same people.
And So there are a lot of historians that think that one of the things that factored into the Salem witch trials are indigenous attacks that were happening in the dead of winter in that area. And so you have this whole thing of like, I think it was in a town in Maine was completely raided and almost
Wells.
was killed. And when the news got to Salem, literally like the next day is when some of the symptoms started with some of the girls in town. And there are also so many stories of this idea of magic and witchcraft involving the indigenous people. And that, of course, you have Tituba, an indigenous woman, who's going to be the first person who's accused because you have all these indigenous attacks that are happening in the dead of winter. And you have all of these indigenous people who are fighting in like today what we would consider guerrilla warfare, but to them that was just how they did things.
Yes, it wasn't the European way of doing things.
Right, exactly.
So
Like
of course it's uncivilized and
quote
savage,
unquote
air
guerrilla
quotation.
warfare, whatever.
Yeah.
Of just the smart way of if the snow pile is high up on the wall,
You
we'll
got a
just
bunch of sinners there.
use that to our. But yeah, I mean the Salem witch trials, there are a lot of historians who are lately looking into these theories that one of the major things that factored into this was the fear of indigenous attacks. So it's so interesting to me that you have this area in Deerfield that is constantly under threat of attack. And it's the dead of winter, and they're just like, we're fine. Who's going to come in winter? When literally
We're good. It's
12
not our
years
problem.
beforehand, you
We
have
wouldn't do it, so no one else would.
right, you have like entire towns that are just being like wiped out in the middle of the night in the dead of winter because that's a smart time. If your goal is annihilation, if you don't have political stuff behind it, or if your goal is to get in and get out as quick as possible and take people and march them back to where you are, why are you gonna wait until like, oh, meet you on at dawn in springtime and we'll fight? Like, no, you're just gonna do it now, right? And so I just find it so interesting, this like false sense of security that you have in the winter when literally, I mean, at least for my knowledge, 12 years beforehand, you have these insane raids that are happening that may have led to like, you know, Salem witch trials. And over here in Deerfield, you have the guy who feels so safe that he's hypothetically, allegedly falling asleep.
Took a
Um,
straight up nap.
just napping it up. And like that's the night that he took a nap.
I'm sure it wasn't the only night, but it's probably definitely the last one.
Yeah. No one was taking naps after this or just chugging
Oh.
coffee for the rest of forever. All right. So they've made their way into Reverend Williams' house. Reverend Williams goes to fire the gun. It misfires. And then what happens?
Divine intervention and whatnot.
Then
So there was 12 houses inside the stockade. Many of them were infiltrated, many of them were burned. The goal was not to steal gold or muskets or plunder these things. The goal was to kill and or to take captives. So the captives that they were looking for, like I said before, Reverend John Williams was like their prized goose, the golden goose of the raid. But two of his younger children were murdered right on his doorstep. Terrible, terrible way to go. Because they were of no use. They could not be taken captive because they were too little and couldn't walk the months that it took to get there.
infant.
Yes. Yes, infants. And that isn't the only house it happened to. There were families that hid in basements thinking that they could escape being looked at, except their houses were burned and they were burned inside the basement. There was a house that withstood fire. Again, there was a house that was in one of the most northern corners. It was Bononi Stebbins' house, and he had 11, 12 people in there, not necessarily all his family, but some of the residents who lived outside the Palisades would like come in like for extra security and whatnot. And The house, because Benoni was a little bit richer than some of the other people, was fortified. So inside the walls were bricks. So bullets weren't going through. And their door was extra strong. And so they were heavily outfitted with guns and other ammo to be used to fight back against them. And then the house ended up being burnt to the ground, but the only person that was killed on the house was Benoni himself. So like there was different fates depending on the raiders who went to their house looking for the things they wanted. Now, what the saturation of French versus indigenous people is it's not controversial. It's just it's not set in stone. We know there was about 200 indigenous people and anywhere between 50 to 100 like French people. Like there was definitely a different level of the people that were doing the fighting and the people that were out back like telling them what to do. So a lot of the people, a lot of the raiders, and again that has its own connotation to it, but a lot of the raiders were indigenous warriors that were going in and attacking these houses and looking for things they needed, and a lot of them were people. They were looking for people.
So I want to ask, why exactly was Reverend Williams so much of a target? Like, is it just because of the amount of money that they could get for him? Was it like what was it that made him the main target? Do you know?
Well, being the most prominent person in town and being the reverend, he one had the most money. Two, he married a Mather, Eunice Mather, which was
The Mather.
Cotton's cousin.
Forgot about that.
I believe so. There's that ransom
cousin.
money part.
Cotton's cousin.
So there's connections and things, and there's also the idea that if he was captured and brought to Canada, a Protestant minister, if they could keep him in Canada, or if they could turn him Catholic, that would have been like a huge blow to like the Protestant religion and the followers going, well, if my minister believes that Catholicism is the way of the future, then maybe I do too. And so there was a religious aspect to it too. And you know, when he was actually taken captive and brought up to Canada, not everyone was treated the same way. Some were brought to indigenous villages and married into the family. Some were put as slaves in the French cities and towns. Reverend Williams actually lived with a French family, given really nice clothes and a feather bed. He was given pens and papers. And he worked with the French to try to get some of the native English, the English people back in ransoms. Like they wanted him so bad because of how powerful he was as a human being, and how powerful he was as a reverend, and how well known he was in the east of Massachusetts as it was. And he got treated pretty well. This whole prisoners of war thing would have been a lot easier had all of these it was 112 people that were taken from Deerfield when the raid was over, and only 80 ended up making it up there. But if you had kept all 80 people like in one jail cell, being able to go there and to pick and choose ransom would have made it a lot easier. But they spread out all over Canada and northern, you know, America and whatnot. So being and they were all not all taken by the French. Some were taken by the Abenaki. Some were taken by the Mohawks and the Kanawake Indians, which are the subset of that's where the village of the Mohawk Indians lived. They lived at Kaniekahaka. They lived in Kanawake, and they were the Kaniekahaka Indians, Kaniekahaka tribe. And Reverend John Williams, again being the golden goose that he was, and treated so well that he was, and could read and could write and had influence in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was working with the French and the English to try to get most of these captives back from these different tribes And sometimes it works and sometimes it didn't.
Right.
And also he spoke English, and there was people in France and New France that spoke English. So he was like almost like their center cog in the wheel of what they wanted to get and how they wanted to do that. Continuing on with the Reverend John Williams story, he was up in New France for 2 years. So a lot of things happened, and a lot of people came to try to get him to come back, but he was one of the last ones because he worked so hard to try to retrieve other captives that were there.
Right.
Going back to the raid night, 41, depending on what source you read from, 41, 43, 45, there were
49.
40-ish people that were killed during the raid, including women, children, old men, young men, garrison soldiers that were just stationed there, but there was like a couple of them.
It's mostly people who like couldn't make the trek, right?
Not necessarily, maybe people who fought back. There were people that these indigenous people, they had their own indigenous classes. They also had guns. And so the Deerfield residents also had guns. So there was bullet flying everywhere. But Benoni Stebbins fought back and he was killed. They saw a benefit to capturing men. But sometimes it didn't end up proving fruitful. For example, interesting fun fact, there were enslaved Africans in Deerfield at this time, 2 of which were owned by Reverend John Williams himself. They were husband and wife, and their English names were Parthena and Frank. And Parthena was murdered in the Williams house, or around the Williams house, because legend has it that she was trying to protect the 2 children that actually were killed, like murdered immediately, and she was hopefully trying to protect them, or they thought that she was trying to, which is why she didn't make it. They actually captured Frank, and he actually started to take the walk with them up to Canada, but he didn't last. The story goes that some of the indigenous people got drunk, and I don't know if they picked a fight, or I don't know if someone got mouthy, or I don't know if there was a struggle, but they ended up murdering the enslaved man Frank like a day or 3 days into the trek. I think it was day 1, like day 1 or day 2. And they were taking him because he, being enslaved, he was already a slave for them, so they would have been a slave for wherever he was going to end up, whether it was in the French territories or in the indigenous territories. And that would have been helpful, but it was too much. They decided that along the trek it was too much for them to handle, so they murdered him. And again, when we were talking about who they took and whatnot, they were looking to take women to be able to repopulate their civilizations and their tribes. But one of the captives that was taken was Eunice Williams, which was Eunice Mather, the cousin. But she had just given birth 7 weeks prior to that. Her baby was killed almost immediately because the baby wasn't able to walk all the way up, and they didn't want to carry it and to feed it and take care of it, and it would scream and create too much of a hassle on the trek. But they did take her, but she didn't make it past 3 days because she was so weak, she was slowing everyone down. So they actually, the raiders actually murdered her not even a couple miles away from Deerfield. Yeah. So, and that's actually, there is a memorial, and she has a covered bridge named after her. But segue, it's not funny, but what I've learned in colonial history is that there's about 4 names that they use like 100 million times. John is one, William's another, Elizabeth, Hannah, like the same names are used almost over.
Sarah over and over and over again.
over and over and over. Cotton, not so much. Increase, not all the time. Mercy, a couple times. There's a couple Mercies, but
Cotton was named Cotton Mather because that was his mother's maiden name.
Cotton.
Yeah. So his mother's maiden name was, I don't remember what her first name is, but her maiden name was Cotton. And so that's why they named him Cotton Mather, was to sort of like give honor to her family or whatever. So there's probably like no other. Who would name their kid Cotton? Who would name their kid Increase? But the Puritans were weird. I mean, they named their kids like Silence and Difficulty and
Thankful and remembrance.
yeah, totally.
That's a Sheldon remembrance. That's a Sheldon. Eunice Williams, mom, had a girl. Eunice.
Yeah.
She was 7.
That was pretty common too. Like nowadays we just kind of associate like men naming their sons after them. But back then, like you had a lot of parents who would, like here in the Salem witch trials, you had Ann Putnam Senior and then Ann Putnam Jr. Although they wouldn't call them that in the records, it would just be like Ann Putnam and Ann Putnam. And that's why things
Yeah.
are
Your Ann Putnam, who was born in blah blah blah, but your Ann Putnam that was born in blah blah blah, and then her daughter was Ann Putnam, which was born in blah blah blah.
Right. And that's what makes it like so confusing sometimes when you're reading these records because they don't put that in the records. They don't write like Ann Putnam, parentheses, 1684 to whenever. They just write Ann or Ann Putnam or Eunice Williams, they don't.
I wish you could see George Sheldon, the owner of the Pocahontas Valley Memorial Association. He wrote the history of Deerfield in 2 volumes, and one of the volumes is genealogy. So you start with, the Williamses family when they were living in England, and then you see John 1, John 6, John 7, John 9, and they're all John Williams. But it's a complete another mess, but you have to go by their birthdays. There's a couple Hannah Sheldons, which I'll get to shortly, but there was 2 Eunice Williams. Eunice Williams' mom, who was murdered while she was taken captive after the raid. And then there was Eunice Williams' 7-year-old, who was, again, not necessarily a golden goose, but she was treated pretty well on the captive march up to New France. She was actually carried on backs of her captors. Some of the captors had like specific people they looked after. John Williams talks about his captor and how he bonded with his, and how his captor actually fought off other indigenous men who got mad at him or mouthed off to him or wanted to kill him. And he says, no, this is mine. I'm protecting him to get him up to where he needs to go. Eunice, the daughter, had one, and he carried her on her back, and she survived the journey. And she got all the way up to New France. And what ended up happening was she was separated from her dad. And she was brought to Kanawake, which is the Mohawk village in New France. And being 7 years old, she was easily formed and easily not manipulated, because that's one of those terms that they kept using. Well, the English people said that she was manipulated, but the indigenous tribes said that she was cultivated to becoming actually fully absorbed into the Kanawake tribe. And when she was 13, she ended up marrying a soldier and birthed children. And she was never brought back to the British colonies, and she actually lived the rest of her life as a Catholic French indigenous Mohawk and died up there. That's one of the most talked about stories of the 1704 raid. Reverend John Williams and his diary, and the captivation of Eunice Williams. There's a opera that was made. An opera. I haven't seen it, but I'm looking forward to it. Maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll just put it on myself. It'll be a whole big thing. It'll be my musical theater background.
What's it
she
called?
was back. Yeah, the opera of Eunice Williams, I think. Like straight up.
I wonder if it's on YouTube. Oh, it was made by Old Deerfield Productions.
Yeah. I think it was for the 300th anniversary, which was in 2004.
Yeah, so it has the Captivation of Eunice Williams, was produced by the Old Deerfield Production, July 2004, in the Reed Theater in Deerfield. How interesting. All right.
They made an opera.
All right.
But yeah, her story is,
I'll link it in the description
oh
for
yeah.
as well.
As long as it's from that website, the 1704,
Mhm.
that's the Memorial Hall Museum's website.
Okay, cool.
It's one of the offsets. It's an award-winning website. It's very exciting. It won big things. It's incredible, and there's a vast amount of knowledge that you can link in your podcast. If anybody wants to prove me wrong about anything I said, it's in there. But the
Sure.
story of Eunice Williams is it's famous. It's operas, there's books, there's plays, there's poems. Um, but in the end, the story that's told the loudest is the fact that she was kidnapped, she was brainwashed, and she was forced into marriage, and that she was forced baptized into Catholic, and woe is me, horrible thing. Can't believe we never got her back, and her soul is forever ruined. But again, the people that are telling the story are the people that were raided and the people that didn't get a chance to get her back. In the end, yes, she was 7 when she was kidnapped, which is true. And yes, she was married at 13, and she married Arosen, Arosen, a indigenous man in Kanien'kehá:ka, um, indigenous person, and she had kids. In the end, she ended up traveling to Deerfield. I think she went to Connecticut a couple times. She spoke French. She spoke the Kanien'kehá:ka language, and she made her decision. She didn't want to come back. When it got to the point when Reverend John Williams is old, Stephen Williams, her brother, was also taken captive and ended up being brought back to Deerfield. They kept in touch, but like we don't know her story from her perspective. We know her story from oral traditions and from the Kanien'kehá:ka stories that were told about her. But if you think about it, she was in a very, very strict religious household, and her dad was a reverend. And then she was able to be brought up on this new. She was able to think of the Catholic religion, and I assuming being a young kid in a Protestant household, probably didn't know too much about other religions. She definitely didn't know about other cultures. Maybe this one fit her better. Maybe she was thriving here. Maybe she was able to experience things that she wouldn't have been experience. So again, this story, which has often been told about the absolute tragedy of losing basically a daughter dying, and this woman, the shell of a human being, is no longer like Eunice Williams, but like we don't know her side of the story and what she wanted, and how when she was an adult she could have come back if she wanted to, and she didn't.
I was gonna say it just sounds kind of liberating. Like, yeah, there could be some aspect of brainwashing or grooming or
Stockholm syndrome, those things.
right. There could be that, but that's one side of the story. But it could also be that like she chose to stay. You know what I mean? Like that just I think of again Salem witch trials. That's like my main
Well, that's what I
that's
use Deerfield as a reference all the time for
right.
everything I know.
But I think of like, in the witch trials that started in the house of a reverend. It's really interesting the like correlations between like this Deerfield story and the Salem witch trials. The entirety of the beginning of the witch trials here in Salem started in the house of a reverend. And there are some historians that think that because Reverend Paris was so oppressive and because to be a Puritan minister wasn't just to hold services on Sunday. You had to
You're basically the Pope. Yeah.
right, like you had to practice your sermons, you had to live by example. And when you think of the way that the Puritans preached, which is fire and brimstone, and you deserve God's hatred, and he hates you from the second you are born until the second that you die, and maybe perhaps you're one of the people who has been able to make it into heaven in this predestined way, but at the end of the day you have no control over that, and you are flawed and you are sinful. And the ideas behind that as well of like with this massacre, the children who were killed are not even children who would have been able to have a surefire way to heaven, right?
Mhm.
Like you know, even Eunice's two younger siblings who were killed, to the Puritan faith, you can't even have the comfort of saying, well, they were an innocent soul, and so they didn't, you know, they were so little, 7 weeks old, they didn't have time to sin. And so surely they are in, no, the Puritans were saying, you're born in sin. It doesn't matter. If you die as you are coming out of your mother's womb, if you make a single cry and then you die, you're going to hell because you weren't baptized. And who knows, was he an ordained reverend? Because there was a lot of stuff going on during that time period.
He went to Harvard, so
So,
he went to the whole schooling thing and everything.
because
So
there
yeah,
were
he was,
some weird
funny
things
enough, he was the third choice. There was two other choices of people to go to Deerfield, and they didn't want to go because they were scared. And J.J. Williams was like, "I got this. I'm
yeah.
going."
Yeah. It's just interesting. Like this whole, like, okay, yeah, I understand that argument of Stockholm syndrome, whatever, brainwashing, whatever. But I don't know. To me, like, if my options are between Puritanism and Catholicism and I have no other options,
It's gonna be a tough decision.
Catholicism is a little bit better. At least
Well,
Catholicism, like, isn't so fire and brimstone, you're hated, all of these
no,
things.
it's a bunch of guilt. It's a
It
lot of
is a
guilt.
bunch of guilt. It is
But
but you have
she did get
purgatory.
baptized.
You have the chances to do all these different things, to not make this a religious topic of
Not
conversation.
going down religion, but she got baptized and she can go to confession and she can absolve her sins other than the fact that you sin and you die and you go to hell.
Yeah, it's just, that's very interesting. But I mean, to the Puritans, it would have been like her marrying into an indigenous group would have been bad, but the worst thing probably would have been the daughter of a reverend converting to Catholicism. I mean,
The second worst, because the worst would have been the Reverend converting to
right,
Catholicism,
right,
which
right.
they asked him hundreds of times. And they actually, and he wrote in his diary, they said, "We'll give you your children back if you convert to Catholicism." And he said, "No." He said, "I am the Reverend. These are my people, my sheeples.
Yeah.
If I fall, they fall, and I can't do that to myself." And he got religiously persecuted by it. The French Catholics, didn't, took him out of the room with a feather bed, and put him in a jail cell for a little while and moved him around. And he was in different. He was kind of paraded around a lot. Like I said, he was constantly working to try to get, as an intermediary, trying to get captives back and whatnot. But they actually kept bringing him to different places and moving him within the different parts of New France because he's a reverend. He would preach. They gave him a piece of paper. He would write. So like he started spreading his good news and doing those things. And I'm like, nah, I got to put you somewhere else. You're too much of an influence.
Yeah. You're giving too much hope to these people.
You're in too much hope. These people. We don't want them to have hope. Hope is a powerful beast.
Yeah, for sure. So interesting. All right. So then what
One
happened?
one one of the stories I did not get to tell, and this was like an hour ago. Um, one of the houses that was attacked was owned by Ensign John Sheldon.
Mhm.
And ensign is an honorary military term. He was like way down here, but like he was in the military. I'm thinking like it was a private, but it was like less than that.
Mhm.
Maybe a militia thing. So he had money and he built a pretty big, strong house. And he had a shutters on his windows, bricks in between his walls, and a fortified door.
Mhm.
And he was one of the houses that the raiders actually ran by to go to John Williams' house because he was within the stockade, but he was closer to the gate and whatnot. And then they ended up like turning back around and trying to infiltrate his house. So what happened is the indigenous raiders that were at his door tried to get in, they couldn't. Knocked on the door, they couldn't get in. They wielded their tomahawks and hatchets and hammers and guns and whatnot and tried to break down this door. And they were actually not able to break down the door. They were able to create a hole in the door, And the door had two pieces. It had an outside and inside, and the outside had wood going vertical, and on the inside it had wood going horizontal. So it strengthened the door. They had iron nails in the door, which strengthened the pieces together. So when they were trying to break down this door, they weren't able to shred it apart, but they were able to create a hole in between those two sides of the door. And they actually were able to put a musket through it. And they shot a bullet into the house, and it actually killed Ensign John Sheldon's wife, Hannah, because her bedroom was on the first floor, and that's just kind of the way that the gun, that's just kind of the way the bullet traveled. Right. Shameless plug, Memorial Hall Museum, where I'm the assistant curator, has not only the bullet that killed Hannah Sheldon, but we also actually still have the actual door that was attached to that building that has the hole in it. It has iron nails,
anti-witchcraft marks, all on
and the anti-witchcraft marks, the Marian marks. It has the iron nails. We still have the latches that the door had when it was locked. We actually had most of the door because in 1848, after generations of Sheldons lived there and they sold it to the Hoyts, and after generations of the Hoyts living there, they had it as an inn, as a tavern, as a home. They did a lot of things with it. The last owners, who, mind you, had the door as their door, but they patched it up. They patched up the hole with a piece of wood and nails. They were so tired of people coming to see this house and this door, because it was set on fire the night of the raid, but it was able to be put out and the house wasn't destroyed. And it was one of very few houses that wasn't destroyed. And like I said, generations and generations up until 1848 were living in this house with the same very strong fortified door with a hole in it with a patch over it. They were tired of it. They actually demolished the house. But for whatever reason, whether it be guilt or patriotism or probably laziness, guilt again, they actually did not demolish the door. And that's how Memorial Hall Museum actually still has that door that was built anywhere between 1690 and 1699. The house there's a couple different building dates of the house, but when they made this house and the door in at least the 1600s, it's actually still around. The journey of the door, and it's funny because again, I grew up in this area, and that's where we went to go on elementary school field trips, and we got a tour of this door. And this door, according to the Deerfield residents and the Master's Bay Colony and the English colonials, this door is a sign of perseverance, as a sign of strength, the colonial way. You know, they took an American, dream story, attached it to this door, and it's been this icon of perseverance and strength and fortitude. And, like if you work hard enough and you build a strong enough door, you can survive anything. Ensign John Sheldon actually did survive and was not taken captive when the raid happened. But no one actually knows where he was when all of this was happening. Mm-hmm. They don't know if he was fighting or hiding or in Hatfield. They don't exactly know where he was. His like I said, his wife was killed. His son John Jr., again, they're naming kids after themselves, and John Jr.'s wife Hannah, Ensign John Sheldon, his wife Hannah, John Jr. Sheldon, his wife Hannah. Seriously, it's ridiculous. John Jr. and his wife Hannah jumped from a second-story window and John Jr.'s wife, Hannah, actually hurt her ankle so hard that she wasn't able to escape. But John Jr. was able to escape and escaped to one of the local towns. And he actually bound his feet with like cloth and stuff because he didn't have any shoes because he jumped out a second story window. But Ensign John Sheldon was nowhere. There is the legend, it's not legend, but the back door was open. The indigenous tribes and the French were unable to infiltrate the door, even though they put a hole in it. They weren't able to actually break it down, so they weren't able to get into the house via the front door. But magically, someone escaped from the house and left the back door open. So the raiders like looked around the corner and were like, "Oh, hey, do you want to just go in the back?" And that's how they ended up overtaking the house. And so we don't know how the door got opened, but we also don't know where Ensign John Sheldon was. Weird. I'll just drop that there and you can think about it as you want.
Yeah.
Interpretation. And they actually used the old Sheldon house as a place to collect some of the captives and the prisoners. And it was almost like a meeting spot to hold everybody while the raid was happening. They could drop them off and go back and get them. And that they ended up using that house because it was one of the bigger houses and there was a lot of different rooms, and they were able to use that as their meeting spot. And like I had mentioned before, they did try to set it a fire and a blaze, but it was ended up being put out because the house remained until it was 1848 when the house was demolished. The townspeople of Deerfield again elevated this door and this house to this sign of like, we are the victims, look at what we did, we can fight back, like uprising, like we're the people that you want to strive to be because we survived and we won this. They used this door and this house as the symbol, and the actual owners of the house wanted to demolish it. And what the townspeople did is they actually like fundraised and like wrote poems and like sent letters to the editors of papers and were like trying to get the Hoyts who own the house to not take down the house, because it was the symbol of the raid, and it was this lasting memory of how you can hit rock bottom but come back up and create this great town again. And the people that were captives had a symbol and a center to come back to. And it was actually an official letter delivered, I believe it's to all who faint an interest in New England antiquities. Like there's a whole big letter signed by a bunch of prominent Deerfield descendants of the people who were around during the raid, and other rich white men, that they delivered to the Hoyts. And it was the first, or allegedly, the first attempt at historic preservation. The reason they wanted to keep this house was to keep the memory of their struggle alive. It didn't work, but they did end up saving the door. So that's like a consolation prize. But again, this door is still around. It's in the center of Memorial Hall Museum, which is why we call it Memorial Hall, because it's in the room, the memorial room. And you can see all the hatchet marks and the things and whatnot. And this door has become such an icon. It's on it's on t-shirts, it's on spoons. The old Sheldon house is on the town seal of Deerfield. It is, you ever hear the term the stories written by the winners?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is the flip side, that these were the losers of this raid, and yet they still flipped it around to be the ones telling the story. They told the story about Eunice. They're telling the story about perseverance and overcoming all odds and being poor farmers and being able to bring back Deerfield to the height of amazingness. And, like you mentioned earlier on, the Deerfield Academy that's there, that the hoity-toity boarding school. It's actually like ridiculously famous. There's been a bunch of famous people that have gone there. I read a book in high school about a boy who went there. I think it was called Death Be Not Proud, and like it was like a bestseller everywhere. Like it's relatively well known. And Deerfield is went to be this tiny frontier town that kept being abandoned to at the point it was like a really prestigious place to be. There's 3 boarding schools in Deerfield.
3 of them. I didn't know that there were 3 boarding schools in Deerfield.
3 boarding schools, two two historical organizations, Historic Deerfield for one, and then the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association, which is the owner of Memorial Hall Museum, which is where I work, which is where the door is.
So so that's been like the interpretation of the door over time, of this like American dream, American perseverance, we will rise again kind of mindset. Is there any other like interpretation that has been put forth about the door? And also, we've talked recently, and I've read in your papers about like the whole lack of indigenous voices in the telling of this story, of that it's not written by the winners in this case, obviously. But the persevering story that we have is written by the Americans or the British or whatever you want to call them, of having this like story of resilience and story of overcoming everything. What kind of Are there other interpretations with the door? Are there interpretations of the other side that people can explore if they want to?
Yes.
Anything like that that we can go into?
Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association is the owner of Memorial Hall Museum. And Memorial Hall Museum in Pecumtuck Valley, PVMA, partnered with the other historical organization called Historic Deerfield, partnered together to create an exhibit for the raid on Deerfield. Throughout the years, Memorial Hall Museum has actually been updating and enhancing the exhibit that was created. And in 2004, it was extremely important at the time that the historical organization reached out to some of the different indigenous nations and asked for their input on what they thought that the raid was about, or what they thought that their part was, or any thoughts or feelings or anything that they may have. The most updated exhibit enhancement on this exhibit reached out to some of these same tribes again. And we reached out to the Huron, the Kanien'kehá:ka, we were unable to reach an Abenaki, but we have the same person that we had used before. And we reached out to a French scholar who was actually the husband of one of our professors. His name is Matthew Barlow. And he gave us a French perspective on the raid and the door and what the story meant. And it ranges from the French being like, it's not a blip on our history radar. It's not taught in schools like this raid might be in your local schools.
Yeah,
I believe it was,
growing up in the South, I didn't hear about this at all.
But growing up in Franklin County, it's
that is
someone referred to as like a little colonial Williamsburg. And sure, I get it. Like it's a very important piece, and there's live action actors, and there's houses you can go through, and we have our museum there. And this is like the there's a burial ground. There's a lot of history here, but like the Abenaki perspective was one of like torture, and like it's this story is being the story cultivated by English colonialists, and talking about perseverance is the complete opposite. Like it's, I can get you the quote, but it was like almost like a punch in the face. I don't want to speak for them and use their words, but they were like, they were outraged by it. That we took this,
the interpretation that
that you're using them to try to tell your story of perseverance, and we're the bad guys and everything. And it was an act of war. you know, like whoever's telling the story is saying what they were saying, and whoever says the loudest is what they tend to believe. And you know, and it's
Just
we got
continues into that whole idea of like the quote unquote savage indigenous person, you know, that puritanical idea that, you know, all the indigenous people here were savage and godless and this, that, and the other, when like that just wasn't the case. They just had different practices. And so to like boil it down,
a not understanding of the two.
yeah, and to just boil it down to they're the bad guys and they're the evil ones because they did something that happened everywhere. I mean, what did the English people do to the indigenous people here? And so to paint the story of saying like, oh, the indigenous people were the bad guys, like, I'm sorry, the English people were bad guys way more often if you want to boil it down to good guys and bad guys, which you can't do in history. Like you can't, there's no good guys and bad guys. There's like different,
Those guys and the other guys.
hey, there's this guy and that guy, you know.
Um,
Except
there
maybe
is,
like Hitler. We can all agree that like Hitler was a
yeah,
bad guy.
no, he wasn't great.
there's,
You want to
there's
talk about the Holocaust? You let me know.
yeah, like there's a few people that we could just say are bad guys. Oh yeah, I'll bring you back for Holocaust stuff if you want to talk about it. But like, there's a few people we can be like Mussolini, bad guy. Hitler,
Not great.
bad
Not
guy.
great.
Uh,
But like,
outside of that,
there's an oral tradition that explains why the Kanien'kehá:ka people were involved in the raid to begin with.
Mhm.
Like, it's it's not a story that I grew up learning because it served the colonists no purpose. But there is a legend that a bell was created in France and was on a ship being sailed to Kanawake, and the ship was boarded by English privateers,
Hmm.
and that one of the legends says that John Williams bought the bell for his church, and because it was stolen from the Kanien'kehá:ka and it magically found its way to Deerfield, they went to go get the bell back,
Huh.
and it's called the Bell of St. Regis. And they didn't take a lot of physical things. They took guns and food and whatnot, but like the legend is that they took this bell, they put it on two stakes, they walked the 300 miles and months long in the winter, and then they got tired of it, and they ended up burying it on one side of a river and came back later to, like, when they were strong enough and had enough oomph to like bring it back. And it's supposed to be at the St. Francis Xavier Catholic Mission Church.
Mhm.
And the fact is, they are so convinced, the story is that they're so convinced that this is the bell, they actually took that bell, hid it somewhere, like, to protect it, and have another fake St. Regis bell so that you can go touch it as like the symbol of what this St. Regis bell was. But again, this is a different perspective on why they were there and why they joined the fight. They weren't just these
Then the bell
bloodthirsty.
was their door, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The reason why they were there, and what happened to them, and what's their reason, and how they proceeded to right the wrongs and that kind of stuff. And these are the stories that came
That would
out.
explain why they targeted Reverend Williams because he was the one who,
He's the one who bought the bell, and it was in his church.
yeah. How interesting. I love these different interpretations that you find when you do historiography.
Ugh, never again.
Never again.
But yeah, we have a famous Kanien'kehá:ka sculptor that created a sculpture based on the story of the raid and the bell, and it has a pirate ship on it. It has a bell on it. It has faces of women that actually were taken captive from Deerfield and integrated into the Kanien'kehá:ka society. It has an eagle on top, which represents like a lasting peace after all of this have happened. It's amazing, and that's on display at Memorial Hall too in the exhibit. Again, that's their story, trying to tell about how this thing happened to them.
But I love that the Memorial Hall is inclusive to show that side because I feel like that's so hard to find in historic societies of things that challenge like the accepted narrative. So I love that Memorial Hall has that other side of it still has a door, it still has what the door signifies to some people, but it can also have that as well. And I think that that's like really, really a cool thing that more um more museums should do.
And I agree with you. Shout out to the curator, Ray Radigan, because when we were collecting perspectives and we were asking different nations to tell us, do you know about this? Do you have to research this? Have you heard about this before? Like, does it hurt to hear about it? Like, like, what does it mean to you? And some of them were not flattering.
Yeah.
And we looked at this and we're like, oh, you don't see this as you didn't learn about it, or there's a difference between being upset by it and not understanding it or not having it be in your curriculum.
Yeah.
But he was like, yeah, it creates a more well-rounded story because we have more insight on it.
Right.
It's not good to everyone. This door isn't a sign of peace and resilience. It's terror and cold and war and death to some of these people. And we want to make sure that people know that there's people out there that think that way about the door. But that's why enhancing and updating exhibits, especially as one that's as popular as the one that we have, which is the door. When we say the door, people know what that means.
People know what that is. Yeah.
Shout out to Professor Dane Morrison, who I took a class with on colonial history. He told us about the door.
I know.
And I was like, I know what that is.
I know I was in that class with you, and that was like my first exposure to the story of the door. And I think that was the first class you and I took together in person. And he like put the slide up of this picture of the door, and you were like,
oh my God, it's the door. I've been there.
Oh, the class, and you were like, I've been there, I live there, and I'm like sitting over here as a girl who was born and raised in Florida, just being like, what? It's a door, guys. Can you please calm down? And so now knowing like all this history behind it, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and again, you lived in the United States. It wasn't a part of your curriculum. You didn't know about it. And then there's me fangirling over it because it's amazing.
I mean, we learned about like the French and Indian Wars, obviously. We learned about King Philip's War and Queen Anne's War and all those kinds of things. But as far as like if we did learn about Deerfield, it was like real just a passing blip of one event of many within these wars, you know. So it's so interesting to have this perspective of like this is what defines the city. Like this is what defines so much. And the fact that, you know, the door, I mean, I know that there's always been like feuds between like the Deerfield Historical Society and Memorial Hall of being like, yeah, well, you can say this, but we have the door. Like, like you can do that.
Well, the Deerfield Academy, their logo is Reverend John Williams's door.
Uh-huh.
The tagline for historic Deerfield is gate doorway to the past.
Yeah.
It's the door. it's ridiculous and
So
it's wonderful and it's
so
painful
smart.
and we have something that was in the 17th century that's in our museum, and that's something to be said. But like, not everyone doesn't want it there.
Yeah.
It's also a piece of wood. It's also a door with a hole in it. Like, but to some people, it's bigger than that. Yeah. It was placed in the Pocumtuck Hotel back in the late 1800s. And the Pocumtuck Hotel caught on fire. People went in and took the door out of the burning building. Talk about God interfering in everything you do. He tried to burn this door down like 2 or 3 times.
Multiple times. What does God have to say about American propaganda, Lindsay? What?
When I get there, I'll ask them. I'll let you know.
Thank you. Let me know. I will be waiting. As an atheist, I'll be I won't hear it, but
I'll live tweet it.
you'll live tweet it and I'll see it. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about Deerfield and the door and the different interpretations and everything that happened and all the politics. It's such a like deep
There's a lot of layers.
there is. It's an onion for sure.
There's a lot of layers. There's a lot of cogs in the wheel. There's a lot of different tributaries and whatnot. And we could spend an episode just talking about the old Sheldon House, and we could spend an episode just talking about Eunice Williams, and we can spend an episode talking about the indigenous nations and how they got to talk to the French and to be with the French. There's so many different things, and much like you with the witch trials and whatnot, like I'm going to be continuing to learn about this for the rest of my life. And I'm constantly reading and constantly learning new things. And one of the things that's important that we do as historians is to adapt our story once we learn new things and once we get new perspectives, and we make sure that we change our language to respect all sides of the story. Just because I learned about this door as an elementary school girl of 8 years old, and that was how the seed of history was planted in my heart, doesn't mean that the story of the door is still a story of American perseverance and the American way and the terrible things that the indigenous and French people did to us. It changes all the time. And that's because I keep learning, and because we keep reading, and because we keep doing stuff like this and involving more people and more stories. That's how you learn and you absorb this history.
And I
is
think
you don't stop learning about it.
the thing about history is that like I think people always think that history is a very static thing, and it's not. It changes all the time. And through like more research and more exploration and all that, I think it's becomes this like really beautiful thing that people think is just super boring and super like whatever, but I think that history is like the coolest thing. Honestly, one of the coolest things.
It is the coolest things, and I don't know why more people aren't all about history. And if they are, please hang out with Christina and me, because we will talk your ears off all
for
day.
hours, and we would love to hear whatever your hyperfixation is.
We want to know why you have a horseshoe from the 1700s still living in your house. We'll do another one about the horseshoe.
We'll have to do one about horseshoes and apotropaic magic and all that kind of stuff at some point.
What colonial era artifact do you guys have in your house? Please comment below.
I live in an apartment that was built in the 2000s, so nothing. But
my house is born in 1861. There's things that I don't even know that's in that house.
Don't go looking for it. Just leave it. And if you see it, no, you didn't. And if you hear it,
if I see it, no, I didn't, because God willed it to be there.
Exactly.
What an absolute pleasure, Christina. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening today. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. If you want to learn more about the door and you are in Deerfield, go and talk to Lindsay at Memorial Hall, or just go look at the door yourself and talk to nobody if you're an antisocial person. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. Bye. I'm leaving you singing.
I hope you do. I hope you do, because it's my favorite song.